Good afternoon. I'm Darrell West, Vice President of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, and I would like to welcome you to our event on the presidential transition. So what a dramatic week we have had. We have gone from a situation last week when Biden looked like he might eke out a narrow victory to a situation now where he has about 5 million more votes than Trump. And if he gets Arizona and Georgia, he has the possibility of reaching 306 electoral college votes, which is the exact number that Trump got in 2016, and use that to declare a mandate for action. All of this happened with one of the largest turnouts in a century. There's around 150 million people who cast ballots in this election. At the same time, there remains some unresolved issues. One of the biggest concerns party control of the Senate. We have 2 Senate races in Georgia that are going to a runoff on January 5th. And if Democrats win both, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris can break the tie in favor of Democrats. If that doesn't happen, we will end up in a Senate where Republicans hold a 1 or 2 seat margin. Democrats lost seats in the House, which complicates Speaker Pelosi's ability to build coalitions. And if we end up with divided party control of Congress, that clearly will have major consequences for a President Biden's ability to pass his policy agenda. So all of this raises questions about what this means for America's ability to address important problems. To help us understand these issues, we're delighted to have 4 distinguished experts with us. Molly Reynolds is a senior fellow in governance studies. Elaine Kmark is a senior fellow in governance studies and director of the Center for Effective Public Management. Camille Bousset is a senior fellow in governance studies and director of our initiative on race, prosperity, and inclusion. And John Hudak is a senior fellow in governance studies and deputy director of the Center for Effective Public Management. If you have questions, you can email them to events@brookings.edu. That's events@brookings.edu. Or post them on Twitter at #election2020. So I want to start with Molly. So party control of the Senate is still unresolved due to the 2 Georgia runoffs. Looks like we will have a runoff between David Perdue and John Ossoff, as well as Kelly Loeffler and Raphael Warnock. So talk to me about what we should watch in those Georgia Senate races and how you expect them to go.
Yeah, thanks, Darrell, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Darrell's absolutely correct that the party control of the Senate will be determined by these 2 Senate races that will for which there'll be a runoff the first week of January. And in terms of kind of what I'm watching as those unfold over the next several weeks, I think it's going to be a lot about turnout in those 2 races. Basically, who comes back out to vote the first week in January, and particularly who comes back out to vote given that Donald Trump and Joe Biden aren't themselves on the ticket. We can talk more about some of the emerging lessons from what happened in congressional races last week. But one of the things that I think is important is that, Trump, we have evidence that, Trump has helped drive turnout among his supporters. And so will those folks who were excited to vote in last week's election turn back out to vote for Republican Senate candidates? When we look, say, at like the 2018 midterms versus the 2016 presidential, we know that there were folks who came out to vote for Trump in 2016 who didn't come out to vote for congressional Republicans in 2018. Will we see a similar dynamic in a very compressed time frame with this Georgia runoff? I don't know. Will some of the folks who did turn out to vote for Biden, who may historically not be Democrats, be concerned about the prospect of Democrats controlling the Senate? Might they actually prefer the Senate to remain in Republican hands? all of these sorts of things are big questions. We do know, though, that from looking at this year in Georgia and the past several cycles, that African American votes in Georgia are an incredibly important part of the story. The incredible mobilization efforts among Black voters that have been led largely by Stacey Abrams and the organizations that she has worked with and helped build in Georgia. Georgia has driven down the share of eligible voters who aren't registered to vote by enormous numbers. So there are lots of people who are eligible to vote, who are registered to vote, who have been brought into the political process in Georgia over the past several years. And so there's a lot of moving parts here. And we don't know what that looks like when we don't have the presidential candidates at the top of the ticket. My sense from talking to folks in Georgia is that so far in the run up to last week, most of the Senate race wasn't really about the individual Senate candidates. It was really about Trump and Biden. And so how that gets changed in the next several weeks, I think is really going to be important to watch.
So it sounds like Georgia is going to be the Super Bowl for the Senate with party control at stake. So, John, what would be the impact of divided party control of Congress if that is where we end up after these Senate races get resolved? How would that affect Biden's ability to work with Congress and move his policy agenda?
Well, first off, it's incredibly uncommon for a new president to come to office with a Senate that is not controlled by his own party, particularly out of the gate. That creates some real complications for the ability of a president to staff his cabinet, to staff the rest of the executive branch. And I think particularly in an era of hyperpartisanship and hyperpolarization, it remains to be seen what that type of conflict is going to mean. It also means that at best, President Biden would face a Senate with a 50-50 tie, which would mean in order for him to succeed in staffing his cabinet, as well as staffing the judiciary, it would require almost lockstep support from the Democratic caucus in the Senate. And so the ability to do that in a diverse caucus is a real challenge, and it's going to require communication and coordination with the Senate in order to make sure that those positions early on, but those positions moving forward are going to be able to work for the new president. Second, I think Joe Biden is going to take early on the temperature of bipartisanship in the Congress in general, but particularly in the Senate. I don't think he's going to suffer any fools, however. I think he's going to look out at who in the Senate, who in the Republican conference in the Senate is willing to work with his administration, is willing to be level-headed, is not just going to say no to everything. And count those numbers. And if Democrats are in the majority, that count will be a little easier for him. If Democrats are in the minority, I think that temperature is going to be taken with Mitch McConnell, the majority leader. And if he sees a brick wall, I don't think he's going to continue to work tirelessly to break down that wall. I think he's going to work around it. And that means you're going to have early on in the administration a real effort to focus on executive actions. Now, we know right out of the gate, any new president issues a slew of executive orders on a variety of topics. Some of them happen at the beginning of every new presidency. Some of them are unique to the transition. But what you will see likely, even regardless of who is in control of the Senate come January, is a president who ushers out a flurry of executive orders across a vast array of policy areas. And the transition team and Biden headquarters in Wilmington has already spoken fairly clearly about this in terms of climate, in terms of energy, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, et cetera. These are things that are going to be day one executive action priorities from the new administration. And it will look probably fairly different and fairly aggressive relative to previous transitions. And so we will likely see a Biden presidency that is characterized largely by executive action with efforts to reach across party lines to try to get something through the Senate. But I really think if Republicans end up maintaining control of Congress, Gridlock depends entirely on the ability of the new president to work with his former colleague, Mitch McConnell.
So, Elaine, how would you advise President-elect Biden to handle the transition period leading up to Inauguration Day? So we have Trump refusing to concede the election, Republicans filing legal challenges. The General Services Administration has refused to release office space and money for Biden's transition office. How big of an obstacle are these and other types of things that Trump might do over the next 70 days? Elaine, could you unmute yourself, please?
I'm doing it. Okay. Thank you, Daryl. Look, in this transition, as with everything else in the Trump presidency, we're seeing some very unusual behavior. Most presidents, in fact, do give a concession speech once it is clear that they've got fewer votes and they don't have the Electoral College vote. Trump is refusing to do that, maintaining that he actually won, even though day by day his votes disappear and Biden gets more and more votes, certainly nationally, but also state by state where it matters. So this is a very strange situation. A woman named Emily Murphy has suddenly become extremely popular and famous because she is the administrator of the General Services Administration. She has the ability to release the federal funds and say that Joe Biden is the president-elect, and there certain things then happen when she makes that determination. Now, let's talk about the impact of not making that determination in a sort of order of least consequential to most consequential. The Presidential Transitions Act calls for $6.3 million to be used for offices, telephone, travel, salaries for the transition team. I think of all the things that are associated with Trump hanging on and the transition not starting, this is probably the least important, mostly because we're in a pandemic. Everybody's working from home. I can't see crowding people into an office as we've seen in past transitions. I suspect that Joe Biden will do a lot of his interviewing over Zoom. So I think, frankly, that is probably one of the least important aspects. And Joe Biden can go ahead and start forming a cabinet, et cetera. He doesn't need that $6.3 million. I think least another more consequential, but not too serious, is the policy planning going on the domestic side of the government, particularly around the pandemic. Joe Biden has extensive experience with this. He, during the campaign, already put out lots of plans for what he would do with the federal government. Because he's so experienced, I like to say that Joe Biden has forgotten more about the government than Donald Trump ever knew. Because he's so experienced in government, it would be nice to have the agency landing teams. So it'd be nice to be going into CMS and HHS and CDC and figuring out what's going on and what they need. But I think he has a pretty good sense of what's happening on the domestic side. And let's face it, in the transition, the only issue is going to be the pandemic and what the relief bill looks like coming out of Congress. So I'm not sure that what the transition money and legal authority is about is all that important. Where we do get to the most important part and the most dangerous part of Trump's reluctance to concede and the GSA slow walking the formal transition is on the national security side. Because, for instance, the president-elect has not yet received the president's daily brief. This is the most secret document in the whole government. It looks at all of our activities around the globe, including many of our dark activities, things that nobody ever knows about. And the slowness of Joe Biden getting the PDB, as they call it, the president's daily brief, is really dangerous. The other thing that's slowed down is getting classified clearances for Joe Biden's top national security team. After the one of the transitions, after the Clinton to the Bush transition, a new law was passed expediting security clearances for the president's national security team. And that was because given the 2000 election, a lot of people came in while Osama bin Laden and others were causing a little bit of trouble. A lot of people came in and were not read into the national security classified information. So that was fixed by the Bush administration. This is the most serious part of what's going on here. The most serious part is the difficulty with the National Security Council taking the appropriate steps, National Security Council, National Security Apparatus, taking the appropriate steps in this transition. And it is exacerbated by the fact that the president seems to be interested in firing the defense secretary, God knows why at this point in the game. But, there's just a lot of stuff here that is danger signs for America. And that's where I think the delay in having a legal and full transition is going to be particularly damaging.
So it's interesting, even though Trump is refusing to concede the election, virtually every global leader has already called or tweeted congratulations to President-elect Biden. I think
that's right.
The only notable exception to that is Vladimir Putin. So
yes,
we'll know it's really over when Putin congratulates Biden.
That's exactly right.
So Camille, what are your hopes for the first day of the Biden presidency on January 20th? What do you want Biden to do at the opening of his administration?
Thanks, Daryl, and welcome to everyone who's joined us here again. I'm delighted to join my colleagues to discuss the aftermath of the election. And with respect to his domestic priorities, it's clear he's going to have to focus on COVID and healthcare. But I think that as he's doing that, he clearly will need to have an additional focus on the disparate impact of COVID on communities of color from a health perspective. So I do expect him to have a slightly different perspective when it comes to how to organize not only the deployment of vaccines, but also what are the other kinds of steps we will need to make sure that people continue to be protected as we roll out vaccines. And I expect him to have a special focus on communities of color. Obviously, he's going to have to focus on jobs and the creation of jobs in a post-pandemic economy. And there I would expect him to put a lot of emphasis on infrastructure, particularly if he can get Senate Republicans to line up. And I think that might be a fairly easy, relative to everything else, easy win, because we all need to get the economy moving. And there are a lot of infrastructure priorities that I believe there's a lot of bipartisan support for. I think the third domestic priority that he should be focusing on is racial equity and justice and economic opportunity and financial security. And I think there he's going to have to map out a prudent legislative agenda, which is going to have to include significant spending, both for states, but also at the federal level. And he's also going to have to map out an executive action strategy. So I expect that to be quite substantive because of the nature of the coalition that brought Biden and Harris into the White House. So I expect there to be a very substantial focus on driving down the Black unemployment rate, which is kind of the canary in the coal mine for all sorts of folks who are marginalized from the mainstream economy, not only Blacks, but a range of folks throughout the economy. I expect them to focus the Justice Department on police brutality and figuring out how to assess and evaluate what is happening in a variety of different police departments around the country. I also expect him to have a substantive program on that will address the economic impact of the COVID-19 recession on Black and Brown communities, which has been incredibly devastating for them. I also think outside of the domestic priorities, he has a top three, I think, for foreign policy and national security. And this is beyond rejoining WHO and re-engaging with the Paris Climate Change Accord. I think number one is going to be, how do we get trade agreements with China and the EU? I think there's a huge economic imperative to doing that. The fact that we are stuck in a trade war with both of these entities is just, it's really crippling us from an economic perspective, particularly for our large agricultural sector. So I think that has to be number one. I think number two, following on Elaine's remarks, connecting the various elements of the national security apparatus, which have been hammered, undermined, disconnected in a very serious way. And he'll need to reaffirm the importance of national security as a top priority for the United States, both domestically and internationally. And then finally, I'd say in his top three for foreign policy and national security is quickly moving to assure our NATO allies and South Korea of our support. Beyond that, my hope is that there will be a real substantive role for Vice President-elect Harris, particularly in the racial justice and racial equity portfolio, and that she will be heavily involved in national security substantively, where she already has expertise because she serves on the Senate Intelligence Committee.
So John, yesterday you had a very interesting post on future challenges facing President-elect Biden, and kind of outlined a number of different issues that he would face and would have to deal with. And in particular, you noted the need to improve the governing capacity and just the institutional capacity of federal departments and federal agencies, which have kind of been hollowed out for various reasons during the course of the Trump presidency. So could you tell us a little bit about how we can rebuild this capacity that has been lost over the last 4 years?
Yeah, thanks for that, Daryl. I think for a lot of Democrats, they see a Biden-Harris victory as the real win, as the success, as sort of getting across the finish line. But really, it's just getting their policies and their priorities to the starting line. And the race begins now. And one of the real challenges that any new president faces, President Trump faced this, President Obama faced this, President Bush faced this, is that after transitioning from one party in control of the White House to the other, there are a lot of policies that are sort of out of whack. They're not consistent with the new administration because of that party change. And so, of course, any president is going to need to make some changes because of that transition in party power. But for President-elect Biden, there's a bigger challenge, and that is, unlike predecessors, Vice President Biden is facing a government that has really been gutted by the current president. President Trump has purposefully and strategically launched an attack on government, on science, on facts, and that has led to a series of challenges within government. We know that there has been significant flight from senior levels of career civil service leadership within the executive branch and several agencies. And with that is a loss of expertise, a loss of governing capacity, a loss of policymaking capacity that really weakens an agency and hinders their ability to get the job done. We know that morale in a lot of agencies has plummeted during the Trump administration, which makes the ability to work effectively and efficiently even more challenging. There's been a consistent attack on the inspectors general community across government, including the firing of several inspectors general for doing the regular job of oversight. There's been attacks on oversight that Congress conducts. And even though there's always tension between an executive branch and a legislative branch around oversight, it is really at historic or historic levels for the modern era right now. And as Camille mentioned, the undermining of our alliances abroad has really created numerous problems that the new administration will face that really previous administrations have not faced in the past. And so in addition to aligning President Biden's priorities with what the government is doing moving forward, the new president, the new administration is going to have to rebuild the government and try to bounce back from what has been 4 years of a coordinated attack on weakening the government. And that has been President Trump's stated goal: draining the swamp, shaking up Washington. Some of his advisors talking about breaking things with regard to government. They've done a really good job of breaking things. And now it's up to the new administration to try to glue them back together. That's not something that happens on January 20th. That's not something that happens on February 20th. That's something that will take at least 4 years to undo the damage that has been done over the past 4.
So Molly, I'd like to ask you about the U.S. House. So we know Democrats have diminished margins there. Just in terms of the impact of that on the Biden presidency, on his ability to get his agenda passed, there have already been some public discussions and arguments between the center of centrists within the Democratic Party and progressives about what the agenda should be. So how do you see the House playing into Biden's ability to function effectively and get his agenda through Congress?
Thanks, Daryl. So I want to start by saying that in the kind of the overall picture, the much more important chamber of Congress in terms of the prospects for a Biden agenda is the Senate, where we still don't know, as I said at the top, which party will control the Senate. If it is in Republican hands, again, that's going to be the major stumbling block, not what is happening in the House. Yes, it is the case that the House majority for Democrats is going to be, 1, smaller than it is now, and 2, importantly, smaller than most people expected going into Election Day. So the conventional wisdom going into last week was that Democrats would pick up 5 seats or so on a bad night and up to 15 on a good night, and that just simply did not happen. Why? I will be honest and say we don't know yet. It is the kind of data that we need to provide a really good answer to that question about why Democrats didn't realize the kinds of gains that they were expecting and indeed ultimately lost seats. We simply don't have the kind of data we need to provide a really rich answer to that question yet. A big part of what we need is data about the presidential election at the congressional district level. Because one of the biggest questions that I'll be curious to learn the answer to over the next couple of months is how many voters went to the polls and voted for Joe Biden at the top of the ticket and then for Republican congressional candidates. We know from kind of the sweep of the last 40 years of American political history that kind of ticket splitting has generally been on the decline. But the Senate races from this year don't even give us a terribly clear story on that yet. So if we look at this year's Senate races, there are some states where the Democratic Senate candidate outran Joe Biden. So in Colorado, in Maine, in Michigan, in Texas. And then there are other states where the Democratic Senate candidate outran Biden. In Alabama, in Arizona, in Iowa, in Kentucky, Mississippi, in Montana, in South Carolina. Those are the states that had kind of plausibly competitive Senate races. So we really just don't have a good story to tell yet about kind of what's going on with this sort of ticket splitting. The other thing that we don't know yet, and I think need to know to be able to start to tell a story about what happened and what it means for House Democrats, is that we don't know too much about how many voters came out for Trump in 2016 and 2020, but then not for congressional candidates and Republican congressional candidates in 2018. We do know that more of Clinton's voters turned out in 2018 than Trump's voters did in comparison to 2016. But we don't know what that's going to look like for 2020. And so why does this all matter? Because it can help us answer some of the emerging questions about what Democrats' strategy should be in the House and otherwise going forward. Most of what we've seen so far in terms of Democratic losses in the House this year are in districts that were pickups in 2018. And to the extent that Democrats thought they would do better than they actually did this year, it was that they thought they would win more of these kinds of districts that they had picked up in 2018. But if we look at the 8 races that have been called so far where Democrats lost seats in the House, all but one of them are in seats that Democrats actually had flipped from red to blue in 2018. So they're among freshman House Democrats. The only exception is Colin Peterson in Minnesota, who sort of hung on for quite a while to a very Republican trending, somewhat rural district. But the other 7 are, again, these House freshmen who picked up the kinds of seats that Democrats thought they were going to make further inroads into, and simply did not. One last kind of data point on this is that there were 16 competitive congressional races in states that either Biden successfully flipped from Republican to Democrat, or he appears likely to. In those 16 races, Democrats held all of the ones that they held going in. Republicans held all but one of the ones that they held going in. And the one seat so far that Democrats have picked up in the House that is not the result of some drawing of new lines in North Carolina is a seat in suburban Atlanta. I believe it's the Georgia 7th. And so, again, that's kind of the exception that helps prove the rule. Democrats thought they were going to make more inroads into some of these districts that look like the kinds of districts they flipped in 2018, and that didn't happen. And it will just be a little bit longer before we can start to tell a good story about why that was.
Well, I have to say, I'm impressed with your knowledge of political geography in Georgia. I suspect over the next 2 months, all of us are going to learn a lot more about Georgia based on these runoff elections that are coming up. So Elaine, I want to ask you about the role of the vice presidency. You've written extensively on this topic. Camille mentioned Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, who of course made history in a variety of different ways in this election. And you have noted in your writings that over time, the VP has taken on an increasingly important role in presidential administration. So what are your thoughts on how Biden will use Vice President-elect Harris? What would their relationship be like, and what should we be watching for there?
Okay, well, the short answer is the role of the vice president is whatever the president wants it to be. Okay, the president really does determine that. Now, and here we have an interesting case because it is pretty clear that Joe Biden will want Kamala Harris to be the same kind of vice president to him that he was to Barack Obama. So my guess is that she will take on some pretty big, but maybe not very sexy tasks. Joe Biden's biggest job in the first term was monitoring the money that was appropriated to get us out of the recession. And he did a terrific job of that given the huge amounts of money that were flowing into the economy. There was relatively little scandal, hardly any at all. And Joe Biden deserves a lot of credit for that. So you can see him saying to Kamala Harris, look, we're going to start pumping money out into this economy because of COVID. I want you to watch where it goes, how it goes there, deal with the governors, deal with the mayors, deal with the people getting the money, because we want this to get where it's supposed to go, and we want it to be as scandal-free as possible. So you can see him doing that. You can also see him giving to her much of the race and justice agenda, as Camille suggested, because obviously she's a woman of color and is familiar with these issues. And you can see him doing that absolutely, and that be her priority. Although I will say, having worked for a vice president, if it's only the vice president's priority, it's not as good as if it's the president's priority. Okay, so on the race questions, I think it's very important that Biden isn't seen to be giving that away, oh, here, Kamala, you're a woman of color, so you deal it. I think he's got to deal with it, particularly because he's a white man. I think he has to deal with that. And then I think that as time goes on, she will pick up her own responsibilities. Every vice president since Al Gore has been given their own portfolios in the White House that they have managed, and that when they said this is going to happen, the president said, yeah, listen to him, this is going to happen. So there were times during Gore's vice presidency where people on various issues, whether it was reinventing government or whether it was the Telecommunications Act, thought they could go around the vice president to the president, and they found that the president always backed the vice president. So this is critically important, particularly when Biden begins to give her discrete assignments that are her own assignments. He's going to have to back her up all the time and make sure that when the vice president speaks on one of these assignments, it is as if the president himself is speaking. And that, by the way, has been basically the way the vice presidency has worked ever since Al Gore became Bill Clinton's vice presidency and broke the mold of picking somebody who balances the ticket as opposed to somebody who can be a partner in the government. That's why when we went through that period of who was Biden going to pick, we could game it any one of a number of ways. What we couldn't game was what was the chemistry between the two of them and Joe Biden and all the people that he looked at, because in the end, he has to be able to trust the vice president to do the jobs that he delegates to the vice president.
And John, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Elaine just said. I think one of the other important signals for the new administration, just as important as who he is selecting for his cabinet and for some other top tier positions, top tier appointments, is how many George Mitchells does Joe Biden have? There's a deep bench of Democratic elected and formerly elected officials who could play an important role both internationally, as George Mitchell did for several presidents, as well as domestically in that same sort of special envoy role. And so when you think about repairing relationships abroad, you have John Kerry and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton to be able to do that in a very unique way. As well as President Obama, of course, but also domestically, you can see a lot of individuals like President Obama playing unique roles in unique special roles moving forward. And I think that will be able to tell you too what types of priorities the president is really both focusing on and also focusing star power on as well.
So Camille, both Elaine and John have mentioned this critical topic in terms of priorities. And Camille, you gave a long list of things that should be priorities for President-elect Biden. COVID clearly is going to be number one, but economic stimulus, healthcare. We should note, today the Supreme Court held its hearings on the ACA, climate change, law enforcement, racial inclusion, infrastructure, voting rights, immigration issues. So most presidents in their first year cannot address 10 issues. They have to focus on 1, 2, or 3 issues. So how do you think Biden will handle this issue of priority? Like, other than COVID, which we know is going to be his number one issue, how does he sequence all these other issues? Because clearly he faces challenges on many different fronts, but he's probably not likely to make progress on every front. How would you advise him on this question of priorities?
Great question. And I think part of it comes down to what's the constellation of powers in the Senate with the final, tally of those 2 runoff elections in Georgia. So that's number one. And then, I think the second kind of perspective is looking at the coalition that brought him to power and looking at who it is who ended up in the coalition that voted for Trump and forecasting 2 years down the road to midterms, right? What kinds of wins they're going to need to have to either keep that coalition together or bring more people out of the previous Trump camp into their coalition. So, and I think that's going to be, I actually think those are the kinds of shaping sort of forces that will help him and Vice President-elect Harris to formulate their priorities, particularly their domestic priorities. As I said before, there's a whole set of foreign policy and national security priorities that just have to be attended to and likely will not conflict with the domestic priorities as much. But on the domestic front, what I would say is that the Black community in particular, but a lot of other communities of color came out for Biden and Harris. And their coalition, as we understand from exit polls, is incredibly multicultural. They will have to deliver something that really speaks to racial equity and to economic opportunity. If they fail to do that, I think that coalition then splinters into, the more leftist elements, the more centrist elements, et cetera. And that's really going to be hard to keep together. And as you're approaching midterms, it could get really messy. So I think they absolutely need to deliver something there. And actually, that might seem, challenging, but we are going to be pumping a lot of money into the economy. And so the key here is just at the very start of that process to really focus on the priorities around economic opportunity across a variety of communities of color. And so you have an opportunity to shape those and direct those infusions of cash, and to actually ask for metrics, and to involve a range of actors that were very involved in the election and now involve them in the process of making sure that there are actual wins in that area. So I expect that to be an absolutely top priority. And the other thing I will say, and something that I wrote about in a blog a few months ago, is that when you sit in the executive branch, you have the opportunity to leverage all the authorities within executive agencies to focus on whatever your priorities are. And so you go through all, you hire a legal team and they go through all those, you have a legal team in each of those agencies, you go through every single authority and figure out which of those authorities you can train on actually delivering on greater economic opportunity and on equity. And there's a way to do that. And I advise that they actually set up a commission that will focus on that specifically. And then you make sure that all those initiatives are coordinated across the government. So I think there are ways to do that, but I think Biden is going to have to be very, very intentional and very explicit when he focuses on this particular priority, which will be key for him, definitely in the midterms. And it will be key for him to be able to expand his base midterms and beyond.
Great answer. That definitely makes a lot of sense. So I have one last question for each of you, and then we're going to move to questions from our audience. And again, those of you who would like to submit questions, you can email them to events@brookings.edu. So the question I want to pose to each of you is just, what do you see as the greatest barriers right now to President-elect Biden in terms of achieving political and policy success? And whatever the barrier you cite, how can you overcome that? Molly, we'll start with you.
Mitch McConnell. So
That's a pretty big barrier.
It's a little glib, but I mean, genuinely, I think that especially if Republicans do maintain control of the Senate after those two special elections in Georgia, if we are to understand anything about Mitch McConnell, it's that his interest is in maintaining the Republicans' political power in the Senate. And so he will be looking ahead to the 2022 Senate election map and making calculations about what he thinks is most likely to hold the Senate in Republican hands. He'll be aided in that by the fact that one of the closest things we have to an iron law in American politics is that the president's party tends to lose seats in the midterms. Now, the map in 2022 looks somewhat better for Democrats than it does for Republicans, but that has been true before, and gains have not necessarily materialized. And so I think that just sort of McConnell's single-minded focus on maintaining political power for Republicans will be Biden's biggest challenge. And I think that in terms of what he needs to do to overcome it, coming back to something Camille was just talking about, something John and Elaine have also mentioned, is that I think Biden will really need to use some of the powers of the executive branch to try and move forward on some of his policy goals. I think I tend to think about this as kind of what it means to do the presidency. So, and I think Biden, given his experience as vice president, his long experience in Washington, and the kind of depth of the Democratic policy bench, that there'll be a pretty good knowledge of where those levers are. But I do think that, again, that McConnell is my answer.
Okay, John, your sense of the greatest barriers and what President-elect Biden can do to overcome them.
Well, I think Molly has the right answer. That Mitch McConnell is the biggest barrier. I will go with something else, and it builds off of a lot of what Camille said at the outset and in her last answer, and it involves just the real challenges that the new president will have in terms of both the real need to deliver for the communities of color that composed his win and his coalition, in the ability to deliver on them. Throughout this election cycle, and it was true in 2018 as well, is this argument that Black and brown communities are not monolithic. And that's absolutely right, but neither are their policy needs. And their policy perspectives. And so I think, one of the best examples of that involves what we've been dealing with for much of this year, the conversation around Black Lives Matter and defunding the police. Defunding the police means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and that's especially true within communities of color. And so I think white Democrats and Republicans look at communities of color and think that they are looking for one thing. Whatever that one thing is, they think of a very linear set of policy ideas. But in reality, it's a diverse, sometimes conflicting set of policy desires within the Black community itself, within the Latino community, between those communities, for Native communities, between men and women in each of those communities. And I think the new president's ability to walk that tightrope and really deliver in an effective way that brings people together is a much taller order than I think a lot of people appreciate, and probably a taller order than the president-elect even appreciates. And he'll know it once he starts in on those types of negotiations and policy discussions. But it is an enormous challenge for this president-elect to do, and to do it well.
Elaine, your sense of the barriers?
Let me do something slightly different. Obviously, the biggest barrier is the Senate, is the Republican Senate. It is Mitch McConnell. But let me point out that, and that's the obvious answer. Let me point out two things, however. First of all, it has been a long time since we had a president of the United States who was as steeped in the legislative process and in legislative background as Joe Biden. Okay, he spent a lot of years in the Congress. He really actually knows a lot about it, knows a lot of the members of Congress. I think you have to go back to Lyndon Baines Johnson to find a president who was as much a creature of the Congress as is Joe Biden. Secondly, Joe Biden likes to cut deals. He's good at it, okay? That's one of the things he did in the Obama administration. So I suspect he will try very hard. And third, even if the Senate ends up sort of close, we have seen a little glimmer of split in the Republican Party. And that split is that while McConnell and Kevin McCarthy and everybody else is pretending that Donald Trump could still win this election and towing the party line, you have four senators, Murkowski, Sass, Collins, and Romney, who have already congratulated Joe Biden. Now, if I'm Mitch McConnell, I'm a little worried about that. That might be that there is a bloc that in fact could abandon me, particularly if Biden's president, and particularly if Biden plays his cards right and does manage to, figure out some way to bring them in on an issue or two. So I think that the Senate is Joe Biden's biggest challenge, but I do think that he probably uniquely among recent presidents is equipped to handle that and perhaps overcome that challenge.
Okay, Camille, your thoughts on barriers, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience.
Sure. Beyond Mitch McConnell and everything that's outlined, I agree with Elaine, by the way, that moderate Republicans are folks that Biden wants to hold close. And they'll definitely be important to whatever his legislative agenda is. But in terms of the additional barriers beyond Mitch McConnell, I would say it's actually, what John and Elaine have originally talked about, the hollowing out of expertise in various federal agencies. I mean, that is a real deep problem. And to the degree that that's happened, I mean, particularly at a senior level, getting that level of expertise for a government that is going to have to move really quickly on a range of problems could be the one, area where you lose some traction early. So I think, from my perspective, I think that could be a real hurdle for them.
Okay, so we have a question from Chuck, and any of you who want to jump in can answer this. He wants to know whether Republican-led states can basically use the fraud charges to justify changing the delegates that are sent to the Electoral College and basically end up sending Republican electors in a state that actually voted Democratic.
Well, I'll start with that. That is very difficult to do because the way the process usually works is that the governor or the secretary of state declares the winner according to the vote. Most states have statutes that say that the winner of the popular vote then gets to send those electors onto the Electoral College. So it's a tough one. One could spin a scenario where, let's say in Pennsylvania, the Republican legislature gets called into session in late November, right after Thanksgiving, and they vote to change their law so that the governor, who is a Democrat, doesn't get to make the determination of who won, that they get to make the determination of who won, et cetera. It could happen, but I think it's very far-fetched because you have to think about who would be doing this. Would really a bunch of people who are also themselves elected, would they in fact take a step to try and overturn the vote of the people? I think it's hard. I know there's been a lot of these scenarios going around, and I think that we will have votes determined at probably the end of the month. We'll have lawsuits settled, and by December 14th, I think we're going to have an Electoral College vote that will not surprise anybody.
Okay, Omar has a question in which he asks, how does the Biden administration maintain a balance between moderate and progressive elements in his cabinet selection?
I mean, I guess I'll say one thing on that, which is that given everything I've and others have said about the Senate and about McConnell, and even about the power of some of those moderate Republican senators in a world where the Senate is in Republican hands, the idea that the Senate will confirm a lot of really progressive cabinet secretaries, I think is like, that's going to be difficult for them. Frankly, it may well have been difficult in a world where Democrats won an outright majority in the Senate, given the degree of moderation among some of the members of the Senate Democratic Caucus, folks like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. So I think that as it's less of a, even if President-elect Biden wanted to nominate a number of very progressive folks to the cabinet, he's going to have, and it's not clear that that would be his impulse, he's going to have trouble doing that at this point. I wanted to add one thing in response to Elaine's answer to the previous question, which is just to say that, while I agree with Elaine that kind of on the substance and what's likely to happen, I think it's also important to raise that the fact that we are having that conversation at all, the fact that someone submitted a question about could Republican state legislatures change the results and send different electors to Washington, the fact that someone has to ask that question, that we're talking about it, is itself troubling. The fact that we are having that conversation, that does as much to sow distrust in the American electoral system as any actual action that a state legislature could or could not take. So I think it's important to kind of put that in context, that even if it's not likely to happen, and I completely agree that it's not likely to happen, that we should remember that having to talk about things like this itself has downstream consequences, and that those consequences aren't good.
And if stuff like that starts to happen, you're basically talking about a coup d'etat. Like, that's the kind of territory you're in those types of situations. We have another question, kind of picking up on the post-election acrimony that we've already seen and the allegations of fraud, et cetera, et cetera. This person wants to know whether you think the post-election acrimony will affect legislative action next year. And I will tag on a question of that of, will Joe Biden actually have a political honeymoon?
Well, I think it's hard to imagine a scenario in which this doesn't have a hangover effect into the legislative session. If you have a set of Trump-aligned House and Senate members, Lindsey Graham, I think chief among them, who don't recognize Biden as a legitimately elected president, it is going to just encourage them to be a block of no. And whether they genuinely believe that or not, I mean, I think deep down, Lindsey Graham understands that Joe Biden has won this election, Donald Trump has lost this election, but there is a political pandering that is going on for Lindsey Graham's run for president in 2024, where he sees that Trump coalition as the path forward, and any means of undermining that is going to be seen as treasonous to the party. And what's more, Donald Trump isn't going away. Donald Trump is going to be on Twitter, and he's going to be on Fox and Friends as often as he can. And if we know one thing, he's more than happy to name names and call out Republicans who he disagrees with. And I think there's a slate of Republicans, particularly in the Senate, who look at that reality and say, listen, I need to do everything I can to make former President Trump happy. And part of that is going to be that type of acrimony in the legislative process because of the way that the president sees this election having turned out.
You know, I wanted to add something to that. I mean, I would agree with John that will initially probably be the scenario, but we also don't know what the Republican Party is actually how it's going to define itself after this election. And so I think initially, they'll kind of stick to where they are, but as it becomes clear, who actually voted for them and who didn't, and where they, have some opportunities and also where they had some lapses, I think you're then going to start to see, different coalitions forming within the Republican Party. And then there's this sort of wild card about what actually happens with Trump after the election, like, 18 months from now or 10 months from now. He is under a lot of investigations, and we don't know how those are going to pan out. But, it might be that the Republican Party is in a position where a previous president now is reflecting extremely poorly on the party because of something that has come to pass from a legal perspective. So I think there are a lot of unknowns there, but I would say certainly initially you expect people to kind of hew the line, but I think that's going to change rather quickly.
Can I just make it a little clear? Camille said this so diplomatically, and I want to say it undiplomatically. If Donald Trump is on his way to jail next year, he is likely not to be a very powerful leader of the Republican Party. You were saying it so nicely, Camille. I thought I'd just put a point on it.
Thanks. Thanks, Elaine.
But every step of the way, he's going to be shouting, "But I won! I won!"
Right.
We are out of time. I want to thank Molly, John, Elaine, and Camille for sharing your thoughts. Great insights both into the election as well as the transition and likely first steps of the Biden administration. For those of you who would like to learn more, all of these scholars are writing at brookings.edu. You can find their work at our FixGov blog, which has been very popular, lots of readership this year. And Camille's work you can see at her How We Rise blog. So again, thanks to our panelists and thanks to all of the audience members for tuning in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.